Welcome back, everyone, to episode 3 of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet. And today I am very excited to have our first ever guest interview with Matias Madou, CTO of Secure Code Warrior. Matias holds a PhD in computer engineering from Ghent University and has more than 15 years of hands-on software security experience, including previous work at companies such as HP Fortify. Matias has led multiple application security research projects and has led speaking and training engagements at conferences including RSA, Black Hat, DEF CON, BSIM, OWASP, AppSec, and BrewCon. Matias, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Very, very glad to have you. And of course, you're going to be doing some training at InfoSec World Orlando, so we will talk about that here probably a little bit toward the end of this interview. But first, tell me, when did you first realize you were interested in developing software?
Developing software. So let's see. The first time that was really in my neighborhood over here. One of my neighbors, he had a computer. He was one of the first people in the street to have a computer, and I struck a deal with him. And the deal was, if I cut the grass for him, I was allowed to be on his computer. And essentially, he was interested in programming. So he was at a financial institution, and he was doing some programming in a language called Clipper. The deal was really, he was doing something for accountants over here, and it was really a book printed with code. And the initial step was you type everything from that book into your computer. You try to compile it, and then you go off. You try to fix stuff up. You try to add new features. So I think the amount that I spent on cutting his grass, I could double or triple, and then I was allowed to work that amount of hours on his computer.
So it was a 3-to-1. You mowed his lawn 3 times, and you got the equivalent amount of time in compute time. Was that kind of the exchange?
The other way around.
Oh, nice. So yeah, I was gonna say you got a 3x return on that. That's actually really awesome. And I'm curious as well. From that experience, how often did you encounter things like crashes and otherwise compilation errors when you were trying to build new features into your creative projects?
Oh my God, I think the worst thing that ever happened to me was I was going to delete the file, and I deleted the whole project. I remember that moment. That was like, oh my God, this is not good. And I remember then you had to go into, what was it? What is a floppy? 1 megabyte, 1.4 megabyte. And then you really have to look into the bits and the bytes to see if you can recover some of these files. And that was truly a nightmare, you know. And I think that's how I rolled into reverse engineering, or trying to figure out how to bring stuff back, you know, and going deep down into the computers.
Yeah, and in effect, I can imagine it's probably the same as it was back then, where the bits that were flipped on the disk were still there, but they just weren't mapped in the drive effectively. So you could actually kind of rebuild the file from the bits and bytes if you knew what you were looking at. Is that somewhat accurate?
I think the really interesting point was that it was all these files were scrambled up. You really had to figure out like where all these sectors and how they belong together. You know, that was a tricky point, if I remember correctly. It's a long time ago. That was I don't know, 25 years ago.
Wow.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how old do you have to be to cut the grass. And I think that's a little bit when I was doing stuff like that.
Gotcha. Now, what operating system was it, if you don't mind my asking?
Oh, and so that was a 286 MS-DOS thingy.
Wow.
I had a Commodore, you know, but that was weird. That was only for playing games, you know. But actual programming, that was on a 286, I think.
Huh. Very, very cool. So then maybe a little bit of this reverse engineering is what led to it. But what prompted you to become more involved in the security side of software development?
Okay, so in the security side, I really rolled into it. So when I was doing my master's at Ghent University, we had a static code analysis solution for optimization. It was a link time optimizer, and the idea was mobile phones that came out with apps, and memory was very expensive. So the more apps you could put on a mobile phone, the more it would be worth. So that was very interesting technology. So at Ghent University, I was part of a project where we were building a link time optimizer for x86, for PowerPC, and I was doing the MIPS implementation. So I was mapping that into that whole framework, and we were able to optimize MIPS applications. Afterwards, after my master's, we were really interested, like, hey, what other things can you do with static analysis? And one of the things that came up was obfuscation. With static analysis, with binary rewriting, you can try to hide the inner workings of an application. So I've spent 4 years doing a PhD and trying to figure out how you could obfuscate and deobfuscate based on static analysis. But the truth was, like, you can do several things with code obfuscation. You're hiding the inner things, but you can do that to hide certain working of an algorithm, to hide some IP, but you can also do it to hide vulnerabilities, where you say, well, we're going to make sure that people are not able to find the vulnerabilities. Well, and instead of trying to hide the vulnerabilities, I thought it would be a better idea to find the vulnerabilities and fix them. So I joined a company called Fortify, which was small at that time, and we were trying to find the problems in code. And I think we were really good at finding problems in code, finding the SQL injections, finding the cross-site scriptings. But the next thing that came to my mind then was, well, it is very easy to find problems in code if you never tell a developer how to properly develop code or how to securely construct code. A static analysis solution or a penetration tester only has to find one problem in code, and he can show a developer, like, hey, your code is broken. We never told you how to develop code, but here is your code. It's broken. So it's a very unfair game. And with that knowledge, so then you can see, like, the move, from doing actual development, actual programming, trying to optimize applications, and then I slowly but gradually moved into security, where finding problems and eventually into training and teaching how people should write secure applications without problems in the first place.
So, especially when it comes to training, because I've done some training myself, when you're working with students, do you find that you get kind of all different levels? So, for example, if I'm listening to the show and I'm a developer and I've never done anything in security before, do you have any recommendations as to, like, maybe where to start, and then what you otherwise anticipate, like, being able to teach your students as part of your different trainings that you offer?
Yeah. So with Secure Code Warrior, it's a SaaS solution. It's a platform where people can go on and it's self-servicing. They can take the training, and it's a hands-on solution where you really go into code and you try to find problems in code, and you find optimal solutions for these particular problems. And along the way, you learn about security. Yes, you do have a lot of different levels of developers. And I think with the solution like ours, there's others definitely out there too. What you can do is you can jump into these training courses that are appropriate for your level. So we have certain challenges that are very easy. We have challenges that are hard. So for different levels of people that know about security, they should be able to skip through these easy challenges fairly quickly and move on to the more advanced challenges. But there's actually another thing in your question that strikes me a little bit, which is it's very interesting always that people not always take training to write secure code. Normally, if we look at students, they come out of university and they want to start a job at an organization. What tends to happen is really they come on board, you give them a computer, you give them access to your Git repository, and you say code, without any training, and suddenly you're surprised that they're writing these features that are very insecure. So for us, we think it's really, really important to do some training first and start with these basic exercises to learn about these principles around application security, and then start the coding essentially.
Gotcha, gotcha. And I can relate to that. I mean, in my personal experience, when I took classes at a local university to me, I remember in our C and our C++ class, there was some deduction of points for not properly deallocating memory that you had otherwise allocated.
Hmm.
But to that end, it's you and I know as security practitioners and professionals, when you look at code that doesn't do proper removal or deallocation of memory, you run into a whole slew of problems, and that seems to be like the standard mechanism of teaching that we've seen throughout universities is you learn Java, then you learn C or C++, and then you learn the other.
Hmm.
And along the way, you learn the values of or the importance of memory allocation and deallocation and making sure your
Hmm.
pointers are pointing at the right space, but you never really get the security side of it. So if you're a listener listening to Application Security Weekly and you had to talk a little bit about some of the important like things that developers are missing as habits, what would you generally highlight as things that maybe schools or universities aren't actually teaching them?
Um, I think there's a very interesting point in your question here, which is what always strikes me if you talk about buffer overflows and memory allocation, all that kind of stuff. If you need to do something like that, what you tend to do is you go look for some code that already exists and you copy paste that into yours without it's functionally correct. It works, and you don't think about the security implications of the code that you just copy pasted in there. Um, that being said, sorry, the basics of your question. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure, sure.
I've
So
lost it.
it's more of so
I've
it sounds
lost
like
it.
buffer overflows is maybe the number one thing that can come out of university students not knowing how to
Oh, okay,
properly
yeah.
allocate and deallocate memory. But what are some of the other things beyond just buffer overflows
Oh, yeah,
as
yeah.
vulnerabilities or weaknesses that you find that students or developers are introducing into their code as a result of not really understanding the security aspects?
Yeah, on web application, you have the OWASP top 10, where the most prominent one is, I think, SQL injection. It's the most severe problem out there in application security. Interestingly enough, I have a frame in the office that I once received from my boss, Jacob West at Fortify, and it's a joke around SQL injection. It's an interesting joke, but the more interesting part is the back of the frame, which is dated 2008. So it's essentially 10 years old. That frame is 10 years old, and we're still working on a solution for that particular problem. People are still introducing that particular problem into the code, and companies still get hacked through that particular problem. So you can address it at university from one side, which is, hey, you know what? We're going to teach you about all the vulnerabilities that are out there and try not to make these vulnerabilities. Or you can take another approach where you say, hey, we're going to put coding guidelines in place. And if you follow these coding guidelines, you're going to produce secure code. And that's really what I'm a very big fan of. I really am a big fan of putting coding guidelines in place and making sure that everybody follows these coding guidelines. And eventually that's going to lead to secure code. So within universities, I would definitely focus on, hey, you know what? Follow coding guidelines. These are good coding principles, and if you do that, it's going to lead to secure code. And to give a very simple example over here, there's this notion of SQL injection. People start to concatenate all sorts of things together. They start to concatenate stuff into a query. They execute it, and suddenly they are vulnerable to SQL injection. Well, if you learn from the start to always use parameterized queries, then effectively you will not introduce SQL injection into your code. So that's a little bit what we're aiming for. Follow these coding guidelines, follow these principles, and if you do so, it's going to lead to secure code instead of always trying to find the problem, find the vulnerability into the code.
And that's one of the things that I think, for me personally, that I've seen a lot of changes happen in just the last few years. So, for example, object relational mapping has become kind of the norm, right? So, like SQL map, or even like SQLize if you're using, say, a node stack, for example. And to that end, it seems like there are more and more tools that are enabling developers to not only write, code that's a little bit faster because they can import libraries and have it do these sort of things for them, but also that do it in a secure way. And I'm curious to know, especially because you have such a vast length of time that you've had experience to look at these things, both from reverse engineering it at a very young age, all the way through your work at Fortify and now onto Secure Code Warrior. In your opinion, what do you feel like has changed the most from secure development or even just in the industry since you joined?
Okay. So there are two parts here. So first of all, in the industry, I think when I joined Fortify, we really had to convince people that security and application security was important. I think today we don't have that problem. There's enough news about people or organizations getting hacked, losing databases, all sorts of bad stuff is happening. In the market itself, we no longer have to convince people that security is important. They know it is important. In technology, I think you're right. I think you're right when you say, hey, we move more and more towards components that are built into these frameworks that automatically help the developer in producing secure code. There's this unfortunate reality that a ton of the code is out there and is still used. One of the training courses we're offering, for example, is COBOL. You would not expect that, but people really want to train a certain group of developers on COBOL. They're still writing COBOL code. So I'm not aware of any company, organization building COBOL components for security. We need to train the developers. We need to help the developers in writing secure COBOL.
Yeah, and it's amazing too, especially with COBOL, because that was something that was written back, I think, mostly in the 80s, if not earlier. And I remember at one point, my grandfather, who's now in his 80s himself, was retired and was receiving basically, I think it was financial organizations were reaching out to him because they had mainframes that were using COBOL for a lot of their different applications, and were asking him to come back out of retirement to write COBOL. So to hear you say that makes it sound like even now, 17 or 18 years after that had happened, people are still using some of these systems, which is both impressive because of their resiliency, first of all, but also then kind of scary at the same time, because you're right, like secure COBOL doesn't exist. It was just COBOL.
Yeah. I think if he comes out of retirement, he can make a lot of money because it's a profile which is highly sought after right now. There's a lot of job opportunity in that area. Seems like people have forgotten about that language, and it's no longer taught in schools, of course.
So I'm curious to know as well, because COBOL is such an old language, I imagine that you probably have some sort of emulators that you're using to allow people to write and test code for COBOL. Would that be accurate?
Well, we actually use a mainframe right now. We have an account on a mainframe that we're using to write our COBOL challenges, to test our COBOL challenges, and to figure stuff out.
That's awesome. That's actually really awesome to have that. And it's kind of like one of those situations where you're like, wow, like is it like the size of a room? Is it like the traditional mainframe, like you could put it in a closet and it's real, just like it takes up the whole space?
It is somewhere remote, so I have not seen it, to be honest. So I cannot answer that question. I have not seen it. I think it's somewhere in the US that we have that machine.
Gotcha. Hopefully it's not in Maryland, in a big glass building that I'm joking about making a three-letter agency joke there. So curious to know, especially because of course there are a lot of different languages that I imagine you teach at Secure Code Warrior. For your training that's happening at InfoSec World, what are some of the languages and what are some of the things that you're going to be doing with your training at InfoSec World?
Okay, so at InfoSec World, I think our primary goal over there is to make it fun. I think if developers think about security, normally they do not think about something that's enjoyable. Developers tend to be very resistant to security because they already have a job, which is not security, which is creating features. And security is something on top of their job. So everything that stands in the way of writing this feature is an annoyance for developers. So if they need to be in training, if they need to learn about security, it's definitely an annoyance for them. So at InfoSec, what we're going to do is we're going to open up a tournament where people can come in and they can go through these challenges, and it's gamified. Our platform contains some game elements to make it fun. And our primary focus is not really to attract developers that are already very knowledgeable about security. We would like to have a broad range of developers, people that are simply interested in security, or not even interested in security, but they're forced to do security in a day-to-day basis. So they want to check out if it can be done in a fun way. Then they definitely have to check out our session at InfoSec. In terms of languages, the very neat thing about our tournament mode is that people can play in different languages against each other. So when you start in the tournament, you need to pick a language. For example, I want to do the challenges in Java EE. And another person can take Ruby, for example, and take the challenges in Ruby and score points in Ruby. Because we think it's very important for a developer to do the training in the language that he's using on a day-to-day basis. It would be a little bit stupid to learn about English if in a day-to-day basis you're talking in Dutch, for example. So the same is true for programming languages. You should not take a training in Java if on a day-to-day basis you're using Ruby. Some of the principles hold, we know about that, but it would be way better to take immediately the training or do the tournament immediately in the language that you're using on a day-to-day basis. So at InfoSec, we will open up a whole range of programming languages, and people can pick and choose the programming language that they're using on a day-to-day basis, and they can go through these challenges and score points and hopefully be the secure code warrior and get some prizes.
That sounds really awesome. In fact, I might have to stop by and actually play with that. Maybe I'll use a language that I'm not entirely familiar with, just to be fair to the developer crowd, right? Like, it's unfair for me to go and do Python because I write in Python, or JavaScript for that matter.
You can do COBOL and call up your grandfather.
Yes, I can have my my technical support, which is a very different relationship because most of the time he's calling me for tech support. So it'll be, hey grandfather, remember that time? Yeah. I helped you with your iPad. I really need some COBOL help here. So let's get on this. That would be really funny. So I know that there was one project that I think just before the show we were talking about, which was your in-editor like checking tool for vulnerabilities as being present or represented in the code as a developer was yep. putting together that code. And I think you called it Secure Sensei. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So what we do with Secure Code Warriors is training. So first of all, we have that training platform, and we think it's very important that developers go on there first and do the training. The analogy that I'd like to make is if you want to fly a plane. If you want to fly a plane, normally they will not give you a plane and say fly off, and that's exactly what we do with these students that come out of university. We give them a computer and we say write some code, and then we're surprised it's unsecure. So normally you first go into a flight simulator. You learn about the instruments, you train yourself, you have to know exactly all the tools and instruments, and in rare situations you need to know exactly what to do. So the same is true if you want to write secure code. You start with a training platform. You have to get some hands-on experience on how to write code in a secure way. The next step, if you want to fly a plane, is you really want to be in that plane. But if you're in that plane, you want to have an experienced co-pilot next to you that can guide you, that can help you in unforeseen circumstances, in all sorts of situations. You want to have that guy next to you that helps you out in certain situations. We think that this is the same for writing secure code. You do the training first, but next you have to have, and we call it the Sensei, next to you if you're writing code in the IDE. So yes, we're having this IDE plugin, which we call Sensei, that helps developers in writing secure code. It's really from the guidance perspective, it helps you write secure code.
And that's awesome, because I know that especially for developers, if I have to go back and look at the code that I wrote last week, I may or may not remember all of the functionality or all that code. Whereas if you're giving me code guidance as I am writing it, if maybe I've missed a certain part of the training or I didn't practice as much as I should have on, say, SQL injection, that's really, really awesome.
Yeah, so, that's exactly what you need, right? That's if you're working on crypto, that's when you need the crypto information. If you're working on queries, that's where you need, hey, this is the way to retrieve data from a database. So it is exactly like that. So instead of Googling, instead of going to PDFs instead of going into somebody else's code and copy pasting stuff in there. Well, the Sensei is there and he can help you out.
That is awesome. That is just so awesome. With that, Matias, are you ready for Application Security Weekly's 5 questions?
I think I am.
All right. So I think earlier you mentioned you had a Commodore 64. Was that your first computer, or did you have another computer before that?
I think it's Commodore 64 was my first borrowed computer. We didn't buy that computer. We could not afford that computer, so we borrowed that computer, and then I was cutting grass to go on the neighbor's computer, and my first actual computer was 386, I think. And actually, in the meantime, I started collecting these computers. So sometimes I go to flea markets, and I have, for example, a boxed Commodore 64, and I think a VIC-20 is older than that one, and I have a VIC-20 too, but that one doesn't work, unfortunately.
Well, you're gonna have to get out the soldering iron, I guess. So with that, other than Clipper, what was the first programming language that you learned?
If Clipper does not count, which I think it does, I would go for initially it was C and then Java in school. So I started with C right before university. A couple of years before university, I learned how to program in C, and then at university it was Java, and then back to C, and then back to Java. It was a little bit back and forth between these two.
So I would ask then, what do you enjoy writing in today? Is it still C or Java, or is it something else?
Today it's PowerPoint. That's a language, right?
Only if you're using macros. That only counts for macros.
So if it's programming, I prefer Java. Yeah.
Gotcha. So the age-old question, of course, is Vim or Emacs?
It is VI. Yes.
All right. Well, hey, even older, Vim's grandfather.
Yeah, I used VI, and even before Vim was available, I had to use Vim then at a certain point. But I still know all these key combinations, and I still prefer that one. Yeah.
Awesome. So also then from there, and I'm going to ask this as kind of a two-part question. From a programming language perspective, if you had to recommend one scripting and one compiled language that someone that's either in security trying to get maybe ramped up on the development side, or just languages that are worth knowing from maybe new developers, what languages would you recommend from that scripting and then that compiled language side?
Ooh. To be honest, I do not really have a preference, because I think it depends on the job that you're tasked with. So I would always figure out what the task is and what's available, especially framework-wise, what's available. So certain frameworks lend itself better to do certain tasks. So depending, and I think that's a constant discussion that we have at work too. We need to do something, we need to implement something. How can we implement that in the fastest way possible and the most secure way possible? So depending on that's a really hard question for me. It really depends on the task, I would say.
It's fair. No, that's a fair answer. And obviously, yeah, I mean, if you're in a Linux environment, you might use Bash, but you might use Python, like and really depending on what you're doing. So that makes a really good point.
Yeah, and personal preference,
Right, exactly. Like if you're comfortable with one over the other, then you probably are going to go with what you're comfortable with, both from a speed of writing as well as possibly speed of execution standpoint. So my last question then, Matias, would be, who would you nominate as someone or even a handful of people that we should interview on a future episode?
For application security?
Yes.
I definitely have a lot of respect for the people that initially hired me at Fortify, which were Jacob West and Brian Chess. I think they were fantastic, and they still know the ins and outs of everything around static analysis. So I would definitely nominate them for this kind of episode. Yes.
Awesome. With that, check out Matias Madou's training at Secure Code Warrior. It's also online, of course, but it's going to be at InfoSec World Orlando, March 19th to the 21st. So check that out. With that, Matias, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.